Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Sportstar podcast. This is your host Nihit Sachdeva, and today is a special episode uh, because we have someone very special. He's an acclaimed journalist who has worked at the New York Times for more than 3 decades. He's the author of the book The Master, The Brilliant Career of Roger Federer, and another book which has come recently. It's called The Warrior, Rafael Nadal and His Kingdom of Clay. Uh, Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
So it's why we are doing this episode is so I reached out to Chris last year around the same time, and he was working on Nadal's book at that time, and it was like 9 or 10 days before the before what was going to be his final tournament. So it feels great to almost after the 1 year after his retirement, we are recording this episode. I'm talking about his retirement at the Davis Cup finals in Malaga in front of his home crowd. Uh, Now, I'll start with Chris, just the basic theme of the book. You know, you've covered tennis for 3 decades and uh, you chose to write about Rafa this time. And Rafa played in an age where, his career is there for everyone, is there for everyone to see. It's there on YouTube. It's the articles are there, a lot of videos are there. When you have a subject like this, how tough it is to write a book, of course, and also the fact that he had already published his memoir, I think somewhere in the 2010s or late 2000s.
Right. I think if Rafa had written his memoir in 2024, it would be a little bit different. I might have had a different approach to the book even then, but it was a long time ago. And it was a very good memoir, autobiography he wrote with John Carlin, and it was 2010. So it's been 15 years. I know that they're working on a Netflix documentary, which I was interviewed for at length, and that's going to come out maybe by the end of the year or early next year. So that's sort of today's format for that. But I feel like there's still plenty of place based on the Federer book and my own, proclivities and enjoyment of biographies. There's definitely a place and a need, I think, for a synthetic literary look at these great figures that take up so much of our headspace for such a long time, Connect with Rafa or Roger, or these Cristiano Ronaldo, these great figures of world sport, and you just really spend a lot of time in their company. And I think the whole volume of it can be overwhelming. And that is the daunting thing. I mean, you have almost too much information, too many
Yeah,
matches. How do you decide what to use, what not to use? And you also have, in terms of public recognition, they feel like they already know the whole story. Of course, they
yeah,
don't. No, I didn't,
yeah,
and I covered them. But you need to find elements that are, I think, original and fresh. And also, I think the thing that's really striking to me from having done the Federer book too was that the early years, the way time has gotten compressed and
yeah.
accelerates, we forget that. And so to go back into that period of 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, in the period of Rafa's career, it feels almost like ancient sporting history already. So to go back and dig into that is really, I think, useful and really rich. But in that, to answer your question, succinctly, I mean, I think my main concern with this book was to repeat myself. Having written about Roger and Rafa, despite the 5 year age gap, are very interlinked. Their careers are so connected, and it would have been very easy for me to sort of change the names and
Mm,
change the titles and write Rafa the
yeah.
same way that I wrote Roger, but I didn't want to do that. And my way of approaching it was, let's take Rafa's signature achievement, the one that I think will stand the test of time, which is the clay court record and Roland Garros. Rafa, of course, is much more than a clay court player. So I decided to use Roland Garros and his 14 titles, which is still mind blowing, as the theme for the book and a way to look at Rafa's whole career through the lens of the clay and the lens of Roland Garros.
I actually was going to ask what inspired you to choose clay and his French Open achievements as the theme of your book, but actually you've already answered it. So another thing, just in terms of the magnitude of his achievement, what do you think? Where does it stand? Like 14 French Open titles, 14 times winning a single Grand Slam. In terms of sporting achievements across sports, not just tennis. So, like, according to you, because you've covered a lot of sports other than tennis as well. So, according to you, where does it stand?
I think given the competition that he faced, during his career at Roland Garros, with Federer being a great clay court player and playing Rafa in many big matches at Roland Garros, and Rafa winning them all, and then playing Djokovic when Djokovic was in his prime, and also a great clay court player who managed to win Roland Garros 3 times and the Olympics on clay there. So I think that makes it more exceptional even than it is just on paper at 14. And I think it's on the short list. I'd put it up there with, Michael Phelps's 20 plus gold medals at the Olympics. I'd put it up there with, yeah, I think you need to stick with individual sport. Um, I think Tiger Woods' achievements when he was at his peak in golf, things like that. Yeah, I really believe so. You shouldn't diminish what Djokovic has achieved. Djokovic does hold the overall record, and that is
Yeah,
extremely impressive. But there's something sort of singular, singularly obsessive, if you will, about this 14
yeah.
and the way Rafa did it. I mean, he only played 3 5-setters over the 18-year period, and he won those 3 5-setters. Yeah, for me, it's as a singular achievement at a tournament on a surface. I think it stands alone. And obviously, Novak, look at what he did in Australia on a hard
Mm.
court, 10 titles. That would have been considered phenomenal and outlying, before Rafa's career began. But now with 14, I mean, 10 to 14 is a big gap. And, Margaret Court got to 11 Australian championships and opens, winning the singles title there. But that was during a time when there was much more diluted fields and
Yeah.
different sort of achievements. So I just think Rafa's 14 is unbelievable still, having covered them all. And I put it in the, for me, of what I've seen, sort of top 10 individual sports achievements in my lifetime.
Uh, Another thing I wanted to ask, when you started writing the book, I think it was in 2022. Was it after he won his what turned out to be his last French Open, or by that time you had already started writing?
I was already researching by then.
Okay.
But yes, I didn't start writing the actual manuscript until after that. And it took about close to 2 years to get it all worked out and finished up. And also because there was a lot of uncertainty about when he was actually going to stop. And because when I wish initially the book was going to come out in 24, and it would have been,
Yeah.
it was unclear whether 23 was going to be his last season. Then he said that he wanted to come back and play one more time and play one more year. So we decided to wait and try to encapsulate the whole career. You may ask me about this later, but the funny thing is that we did that, and the book that you have is the whole career, and we're talking because the Davis Cup, title that he didn't get to go as his farewell, that happened about a year ago, and they lost in Malaga to the Netherlands. But really, the end of his career for me, now looking at it, was that ceremony at Roland
Yeah.
Garros this year, and
Yeah.
that's not in the book. So maybe there's room for there's a bit of an addition, but
A
at the
revised
end of
edition,
career,
yes.
it's all there. But that
Yeah.
ceremony at Roland Garros felt like the end. I don't know for you. I
Yeah.
looking at you, it feels like you feel the same way.
Yeah, definitely. Like that retirement at in Malaga was slightly underwhelming, or maybe not slightly, but more than underwhelming
Yeah,
for
yeah.
a player of his stature. And also given the fact that it was happening in Spain, in Malaga. And so given those sort of factors, to then not have the kind of ceremony he deserved, I was glad that he got that ceremony in Paris. I'll come to that later. Just the thing. So when did you finally come to the conclusion that you want to base this book around the French Open's history and Rafa's prowess on clay? You said you started to research in 2022, but then you had not decided the manuscript and you started writing the manuscript. But when did you finally come to the conclusion that this is going to be my premise and you're going to focus more on his career and less on like his growing up years or his family, because that's already out there in his autobiography.
Yeah, I think it was when I was 100% sure after he won the French Open in such extraordinary circumstances in 22. Yeah, I didn't know if that would be his last. At that point, it was ridiculous to count him out. But a lot of us, I read about this in the book in that chapter about that victory. A lot of us had prepared retirement stories for that day because it seemed like a possibility that he would win that title, and he was in so much pain with his foot, and he'd had to have pain-killing injections throughout the tournament, and he had been in such a kind of a dark state earlier in the clay court season in Rome. I'd never seen him that down. So it did seem conceivable that he would, hit a walk-off home run, as we say in the U.S. in baseball, or whatever would be the equivalent in India, and call it. But then when that didn't happen, it became clear to me that this clay court body of work already was amazing, and it just got that last layer that he put on it was even more amazing. And I just felt like I really had a deep connection as a journalist and as an individual to Roland Garros and to Paris. My wife is French. I've lived a lot of my adult life in Paris and France, spent a lot of time there. And so I really wanted to tell the story of this tournament, which really hasn't been done in English in a high quality way and in depth. And it just seemed to me that Rafa and this place had become one. The statue that's there, of course, symbolizes that. But really, it's the connection with the place and the people that
Yeah.
that symbolizes that. And I don't know of anything else quite like it in world sport where there's this player from another country, not French, who
Yeah.
manages to come here and to Paris and make that connection, almost force that connection. And in the end, it's a beautiful thing. Had a lot of ups and downs, which maybe we'll talk about. But I felt like
Yeah.
uh, I felt like for me, it was a an original and new way to tell this story that deserved to be told. It's not
Yeah.
all of Rafa's career by any means, and hopefully the book doesn't just summarize that alone. But it is to me something that 20, 30 years from now, I think people will go, how on earth did somebody win 14 French Opens?
Yeah.
So hopefully this book explains
Yeah.
how.
I do want to come to that point where you spoke about his connection with the people, because there are some chapters in the book where you talk about his connection with the Parisian crowd, and not every time the crowd was on his side. Like sometimes they were against him because he was winning so much. You can you tell your experience of covering those matches, like being just in the media box there when the match is going on, and you're watching like people rooting for Nadal's opponent because he's been dominating the slam for such a long time.
Yeah, it was a mixture of a lot of things that happened. I mean, at the very beginning, there was such anticipation about him playing
Yeah,
because he was supposed to play in 2003 and 2004,
yeah,
and he already had established himself in 2004 a little bit as a real threat, and then he couldn't play. And so when he comes in 2005 to Paris the first time to play Roland Garros, he's already the world's best clay courter. He already has won Monte Carlo, he's won Rome, he's beaten all the big players on the surface. So people are expecting him to contend, and many, including me, were thinking he would win, which is crazy. Your first French Open and you're the favorite. But his ability to do that as a teenager and follow through, I think, created this fascination. There was huge buzz about him, and he just at the time looked very different with the sleeveless shirts and the pirate pants and the long hair and the just dynamic style. So at the beginning, it was, I think, a love affair. And
yeah,
then people realized what they were up against and how dominant he became. And then you're playing into the weariness with no French men's champion since Yannick Noah.
yeah,
And you're playing with the weariness of so many Spanish players who've come in and done well over the years. And why can't it be a Frenchman? And then Rafa's just tremendous gap he had with the opposition. And then the way he destroyed Federer in the final in 2008, which was a phenomenal performance, but I don't think it endeared him anymore to the French because they wanted to see
yeah,
some suspense and they wanted to see their guy Roger compete. So the match I think that symbolizes the disaffection for Rafa at Roland Garros is 2009 against
mm,
Soderling when he is beaten in four sets. A lot of reasons for that we found out about later,
yeah,
injury, family problems, but nonetheless, Soderling played really well and beat him. And during the match, the crowd was clearly cheering not just for Soderling, but cheering against Rafa and cheering his errors and mistakes. And it really hurt him, really hit him.
yeah,
So that shows you where they had gotten to. And then honestly, it took quite a long time, in my view, for things to turn. And there were a lot of suspicions which I talk about with Rafa, allegations of doping and Spanish
yeah,
doping and Operation Puerto and things like that. So it's Puerto, sorry. And so there was a lot of background noise. None of those allegations have ever been proven. And Rafa ended up winning a court case against a former French sports minister who had alleged he'd been out of action because of a failed, doping test.
mm,
So, but all that I think conspired to sort of keep the French crowd at a distance from him. Not just the French crowd, other crowds too, but really in Paris. And then as he showed over time, his staying power, his commitment to his craft, playing through pain, and also let's be real, much like Federer, Rafa had a period where he was very vulnerable in his career, and I think that humanized him. People
yeah,
realized that, oh, okay. it's not as easy as it looks. He's not this dominant cyborg sort of force. And then when he was able to come back after those difficult years in 15 and 16 and come back at the last quarter of his career and play such phenomenal tennis and show his real affection for Roland Garros. And I think the French really embraced him, and you could feel that in the final years. I think
Yeah,
it was very real and very hard earned.
yeah. Uh, Throughout your book, like obviously, since you've been a journalist for more than 3 decades, and of course, when that happens and you start writing a book, people assume that you already have all sorts of contacts, and so it's slightly easier for you to get people to talk to you and get different perspectives. But still, there are a few voices in the book which, at least for me, I didn't expect them to appear in the book. One is, of course, the French announcer Marc Maury. One is, I think, the taxi driver who took Nadal to the stadium and to the airport during his stay in Paris for the French Open. And one more, I think, which is quite a surprise, is the first player he ever faced at the French Open, Lars Bergmüller. Uh, was it difficult to get any of these voices, like finding anyone for the interview? Just like because you've interviewed so many people for this book, any
Mm.
particular instant where you found it tough to reach out to somebody, find somebody?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot easier talking to people like Lars Burgmüller and Jordi Fernandez Diaz, the sculptor who did the statue of Roland Garros, people like that, than it is to talk to to Rafa and his inner circle. I mean, a lot of my interviews for the book were done over many, many years with my years at the New York Times and the International Herald Tribune. So I had a lot of things already in place and in my notebook, and that was, I think, essential to do a book of this quality. But in the reporting, I talked to another 100 people or so, and there were some real chases. I had Francis Roy was really important for me to speak with
Hmm.
him, who was really Rafa's second coach, second, not a head coach, but assistant coach for all of his major victories and played a huge role in his career. And I think it's been very underestimated. And Francis is also a very engaging, good interview. And I had never spoken to him over the years, and for whatever reason, Tony Nadal being the focus, and after that, Carlos Moya as the coach. So I never talked to Francis, and I knew he was a potential gold mine if I did. And initially, he didn't want to. He was I think he had left the team and he wasn't interested in revisiting it. And then in the final months of research, he agreed to speak to me, and I was so glad that he did because I think he added a lot of layers to the narrative. But it wasn't always easy. Even someone like me who's covered the game a long time, and this is not a book written with Rafa, just so that's
Yeah,
clear. Unlike the
yeah.
book you mentioned before with John
Mm,
Carlin, that was a memoir. This is an independent book.
mm,
Um, I have all the time I've spent with Rafa over the years, but I feel grateful that a lot of people did speak to me, and people like Feliciano Lopez, and people like Francis Roig, and people like Joffrey Porta, who was one of Rafa's early coaches who helped out Tony along the way. And I think it really makes it a much richer narrative to have done the reporting on the front end and on the back end.
uh again, you're writing about Nadal, but again, people expect you to fill the narrative with his rivalries with Federer and Djokovic on clay. So when you started mentioning those aspects in your book, and because there is so much material there for people already know their battles on clay, then how tough was it you to make it interesting and give the readers something new that they already don't know about?
Well, I think I was lucky enough to be able to cover almost all of those matches, their main matches over the years. And in the Federer book, I went very deep on Rafa and Rogers' rivalry. So this book is a little lighter on that, out of
Hmm.
respect for those who might read both books. I didn't want to repeat myself too much. You can't write a book about Rafa and not mention the 2008 Wimbledon final
Yeah.
or against Federer or the 2008 French Open final against Federer. You have to mention those. So I try to
Hmm.
take slightly different approaches with those matches. But I really leaned into the Djokovic Nadal rivalry because to me it's on paper, I think on balance, the best rivalry in men's tennis of the Open era. Better and richer and longer than Federer and Nadal. Better I think overall richer and certainly much longer than Borg McEnroe or Agassi Sampras. So I think it's sort of it's close, but I think for me it stands alone. So I really wanted to dive into that. And I've had a lot of time with Novak over the years, a lot of time with Novak talking about Rafa. So I really wanted to lean into that part of it heavily. So the chapter I think which is has the most fresh material and really in terms of their rivalries is that Djokovic Nadal chapter where I really dug into some of their matches, especially the 2012 Australian Open final, almost 6 hours when they both couldn't stand at the end, and Rafa
Mm.
needed an IV in the locker room, which I didn't know at the time, to revive himself, and just and those matches to go back and watch them again and try to bring them to the reader in a fresh way was a fun challenge, and hopefully I achieved it. But I think you need to go back and with the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of history, put these things in perspective because a lot of the coverage and more so now with social media, it's very immediate, but there's no real long view and no real analytical look at these things from a distance. And I think that's rich and useful.
Yeah, and just by while reading the book, I got to know that it was you who asked him that question. Are you happy that Djokovic exists as a child?
Yeah, it was me.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a famous one, right?
yeah, definitely. Like when you see a response like that from Rafa, like how do you respond to that? Because he's somebody who is like so focused, and you only said that he said that he likes challenges, and then when you ask him about Djokovic, was that like a sign of things to come that he really like he found somebody who was a bigger challenge for him than Federer on the surface?
Well, we should explain for your listeners who didn't read it or don't know the story. Yeah,
Yes.
it was in Miami,
Yeah.
and Rafa had been having a tough time against Novak at that phase, and so it was just I wasn't even planning on asking a question at the press conference, but then I just saw him and saw his face when he walked in. Novak had just beaten him again, and and so I said, so you're a man who loves challenges. It's true you like when it's tough. So are you glad that Novak exists? And he didn't hesitate. Nope. So even Nadal, the ultimate warrior, the ultimate embracer of challenge, who
Yeah.
really doesn't like winning easy, but likes to always push himself. There are limits, and I think Novak was the only player at
Yeah.
any point who was able to get to that sort of level against him where he could push him out of that comfort zone for him. And then Novak comes in after Rafa,
Yeah.
um, kind of in full Novak flow, and I said I posed this question to Rafa. He goes, well, "What did he say?" And then I told him what Rafa had said, and he goes, "Well, I'm going to answer differently." And I guess he would because he's used Roger and Rafa as his fuel. So of course he's happy that they exist because they allowed him to find something in himself. And ultimately he became the leader on Grand Slam titles, number one
Mm.
ranking, head to head, very close with Rafa, just a two
Mm.
match difference, obviously. But so it was a really good journalistic moment at the time,
Yeah.
and I think it was right to re-include it in the book.
I think you didn't mention that the line that made it more famous was, "I like challenges, but I am not stupid."
That's
That
exactly
was
right.
a, and I mean he was famous for his one-liners in the press conferences, Rafa. Like he like in his later years, I think improved his English a lot, but even then, like his one-liners were very famous. Uh,
Yeah,
Coming
the
back,
Aussie Open 2010, the one that always stays with me was after he beat Roger in that final,
yeah,
and he was trying to convince us he wasn't as good as Federer. And the afterward, when we were in our group interview with him and at the hotel in Melbourne, and we just kept pushing him. Come on, you've beaten him a bunch of times now in these big matches. You got to admit that he's your equal or you're his equal.
yeah,
And he just sort of ultimately he sort of just I think got tired of trying to fight the question, and he goes, maybe I like fighting to win more than I like winning. And that, to me, wasn't quite, the King's English, but
yeah,
a beautiful summation of what Rafa represents and really what made him great was that it was the fighting to win that made him happier than the actual holding up the trophy and
yeah.
fighting the handles. So sorry, I interrupted you though.
No, no. So then, you know, you as you started writing the book in 2022, then then comes his injury in 2023, and then that's like the starting of the beginning of the end, so to speak. Where at 2023, I think a few days before the French Open, he says like, "I won't be playing this year, but this is not how I want to retire. I want to play." and retire on the court because I deserve better. Then you're watching him in his last season in 2024, where he's definitely not his usual self. He's slower, he's not that fit at all. Then to cover that last chapter of his career, how tough it was for you as a journalist as well, because as a journalist, you want to be unbiased, but then again, you have watched this player for over 20 years, give it his all, and then in his last year on the tour, you're watching him like suffer. I mean, he liked to suffer, but not suffer like this, where he's not able to execute what he used to in his prime, and then losing to players he wouldn't usually lose to, and then I think the final nail in the coffin was the straight sets defeat at the French Open. So how tough was it for you to summarize that last chapter of his career?
It's a fair question, and I think as journalists, the best journalists are empathetic. I think you have to be. You had to be effective and cover your subjects well. But the best journalists, you can never be truly objective. Let's be honest. You do your best, but you need to do your best. So, uh, was it painful for me to see Rafa in the situation? Actually, no, it wasn't. It was part of the narrative, but I certainly could feel for him. Uh,
Mm,
and in a sense, I always suspected that even though I had my story ready in 2022 for him
mhm.
to retire when he didn't,
Yeah,
I always suspected that he'd have to go through a long period of not enjoying the game and not enjoying the process of competing for him to stop. And a lot of people I talked to as I was covering him over his career said he's going to have a really hard time leaving just because he's so wired into his own inner challenges and he's so wired into, the competitive spirit and losing. It's okay for Rafa because it's part of the challenge. It makes the challenge bigger. But what ultimately did not become okay was just having to constantly, constantly fight his body and just
mm,
not be because of his body to give his best. And actually, in 24, if you recall, beginning of the year in Australia, first couple matches, he looked pretty good.
he
He was
looked
hitting
good.
the
Yeah,
ball really well and had that pop back in the forehand. Looked like he was moving very well, and
yeah,
I think he'd done a lot of work to get himself ready, and it looked very promising. And then the body started to go, and
yeah,
it wasn't just the old injuries; it was new ones. And so this thing started to break down. And ultimately, I think that's what did it. If it had been the same injury again and again, no. But this was many new things, and I think, ultimately just had to bow to the logic of it all and realize that even him, the process isn't enjoyable when you're always doing it in pain and waiting for the next body part to go. But I would have liked for him at the time when I watched the Davis Cup matches in Malaga when he did lose that match against them in singles, and
yeah,
it was after midnight, and he gave a good speech, but it wasn't the organizer's fault. It was
yeah,
the way Rafa wanted to do it, and that's the way it played out. But I felt that was inappropriate for the game to have a champion of that ilk not have a better moment, not just for him, but for the sport and all those who were part of it. So I was very happy to see what happened in Paris this year and that they were able to do it properly and give it the gravitas and emotion that it deserved. But a lot of, Rafa, I think, had to go through 24
yeah,
and the downbeat nature of it and anticlimactic nature of it, from Roland Garros and this Zverev match to the Olympics and losing to Djokovic pretty handily in that second
yeah,
round match. I mean, Novak could have beat him even in a much more lopsided fashion. That
yeah,
6-4 score in the second set was lucky for Rafa. So I
yeah.
just think there was a whole bunch of anticlimactic moments, but a champion like Rafa with that spirit probably had to go through that for it to stop.
Uh, do you think he exceeded people's expectations by having such long career? Because I mean, you must have heard it from multiple people when he came on the scene, he burst onto the scene that with his style of play, it will be very tough to have a long career because it's so physical and like he likes to grind for points and stuff. So, do you think he exceeded expectations in terms of how long his career turned out to be?
100%. Very much so. Yeah.
Mm,
And I think as a player too, I mean, would any of us, we all knew he would probably have a good chance to win multiple French Opens when he came in and won in 2005, but 14, not a chance.
mhm,
And then the body, just the way he was slashing, and then the early problems he had with his knees and his feet.
mm,
uh, with the chronic condition. No chance I would have said he plays until 38. No.
mm,
And I think all of us pretty much would have agreed. And I think if you talked to Francis Roig like I did, and Francis Roig said Rafa told him he was, planning on playing into his late 20s and that was going to be it. I think Tony Nadal felt the same way. So I don't think it was just the journalists, even though we're guilty of plenty. It was definitely not just us who felt that way. And I think Rafa, if you would have asked him, he's tenacious, he loves the game, but I don't think he saw himself playing until that stage either. It's something that had to happen over a period of time. And he definitely exceeded it through, the advances in medical help and recovery and his own tenacity and then managing his schedule more smartly. But I know it was a struggle and he was frustrated at times with what he had to go through. He tried to change the ranking from a 1 year ranking to a 2 year ranking to allow himself to play less. He lobbied for more clay court tennis and less hard court tennis. He didn't win those battles, but he still
mm.
managed to fight through and play such a long time. And it is an upset that he did that, without a doubt.
Yeah. Before I come to the ceremony, I had one question. I think it's towards the end of the book where you mentioned his association with Saudi tennis as well. Just your thoughts on his association, because for the longest time, people thought that Nadal couldn't get involved in like these kind of complex situations. But then he gets associated with, Saudi tennis, and you've written like the country has a record of human rights violations, but he's trying to improve things through tennis. And of course, he's being paid well as well, compared to other countries. Just your thoughts on that aspect of the book. Was there ever a consideration that maybe that's not required, or like how do you want to deal with that subject matter, because it's so delicate and so complex as well, and it keeps evolving as time goes on, because Saudi is now hosting these season end finals for women, the WTA finals, and the next, I think, is it the next year they're going to host a Masters as well. So obviously the footprint is increasing for them in terms of tennis.
Yeah, I think the Masters 1000 you mentioned is they're looking at that more for, if I'm understanding correctly, more 27, more like 28.
27. Yeah.
But it's coming and it's been committed to. Look, I mean, I'm a journalist I'm an independent writer. I worked for the New York Times for 30 years. Delicate, complex, all the better. That's all the more reason to include it. That's why there's a chapter about the doping allegations and the climate of suspicion around Nadal. I think you have to address his career as honestly as you can, and that was those concerns and thoughts were part of it for people in the public. So you have to address that. And the Saudi thing is complex, and you're right to say it's a moving target. And ultimately, how can you criticize Rafa alone when so many people in world sport, from Cristiano Ronaldo who plays there,
Yeah.
year round, or the golfers like John Rahm and Phil Mickelson and so many more who've joined Live Golf, funded by the Saudis, and the WTA, which despite the progress that needs to be made on women's rights in Saudi Arabia, there has been obviously some movement there, but has there been enough for them to justify playing their signature event on tour there? I would argue still not. Um,
Mm,
Navratilova and Chris Evert argued. So I think it's a debate worth mentioning. Nadal is not really an outlier on this subject anymore. I think my argument is that it's one thing to go play. It's quite another to be an ambassador
yeah.
for them. And he took on a very formal role, I'm sure, very well remunerated as well. Don't have that figure in mind. I know his father, Sebastian, was very involved with the negotiations on this. It just felt to me like Rafa hadn't fully weighed uh,
Mm,
the consequences of that on his image and also on what he's projecting to everybody else. I don't think he needed to do that. I don't think he needed the money.
mm,
Certainly, the academy and its growth around the world is important to him, and the Saudis could be a huge partner in that. And there's obviously opening up an academy there. But ultimately, Rafa, when he was pushed on it, not by me, but by Spanish colleagues, stood by his decision and said, I'll be judged on this down the road. And if a few years down the road there's not, positive evolution in Saudi society, then I'll take the blame for that. But my feeling is that it's going in the right direction and that bringing sports, people like me to the country can help uh, open up the country more and provide the youth of the country with more diversion and more and more opportunity to evolve the society. So that's his point of view. I personally disagree with it. I don't think he should have taken on the ambassadorial role that he did. And I feel like he's somebody who has remained very much above the fray. A few comments here and there about women's tennis and
Yeah.
equal prize money that I can see his point, but didn't help him in the court of Spanish public opinion.
Yeah.
But he generally has been, I think a very moral champion with a lot of high standards. And the Saudi thing is I still think highly debatable.
Yeah. Have you had the chance to speak to him after the book's release?
Haven't. No, not since the book appeared. No, I haven't. Last time
Okay.
I saw, actually, that's not true. I saw him briefly at the ceremony at Roland Garros afterward, and we
Okay.
shook hands and greeted each
But
other,
he
said
didn't speak to
hello.
the media.
He spoke to the media, but to me, we didn't have an individual interview then. But we
Ah,
did we
okay.
did greet each other outside, and it was part of that day, and it was good to
Hmm.
see him there, and I'm glad that he had that chance to come back there, and he did it right. He shook a lot of hands that day.
Now, coming to that ceremony, is this something? It's quite something because he's retired just a year before, and then to have that plaque on the center court, he already had that statue, so there was something, some sort of tribute. But to then have that plaque on the Philip Chatrier court where he's won those 14 Grand Slam titles, in the larger scheme of things, have you ever seen this sort of a tribute for a player who's been honored in such a way, like soon after his retirement?
That's a good question. I could be missing something here. I can't recall anything quite like that where a player on the way out becomes a physical part of the stage of the arena like
Yeah.
that. Obviously, there are courts of name for players.
Yes,
There's a Rafa Nadal court in Barcelona, which was
Barcelona.
baptized before he finished his career. Um, there's a Roger Federer street in Halle, Germany, and one in Basel as well. So, um, obviously, not actually, it's not in Basel. I'm sorry. It's where the Swiss national training camp is, and I'm blanking on the name of the city. But those things do exist. But to become basically an integral part of the actual place and surface in which you played, I thought it was a genius idea. I still
Yeah.
haven't found out who came up with it entirely, but I felt like there was a lot of pressure and speculation about whether they would rename the Philippe Chatrier court the Rafa Nadal court. And I think the sense was that the statue was already in place that had been done during his career. Rafa is not French. Philippe Chatrier is not very well known even in France anymore, but he was somebody who played a massive role in the French Open and Roland Garros being the modern day successes that they are. Former president of the French Federation and the International Tennis Federation, and I think it's fitting that he have his name on that stadium. So that was once you've rejected that of renaming it for Nadal, you can't honor him with a minor court. That wouldn't seem right because he did all his
Yeah.
damage on Chatrier. So how do you do it? And I thought it was a wonderful compromise and a wonderful innovation, and it caught me by surprise. And just like it caught Rafa by surprise, and I think it was already by the end of the tournament a place of pilgrimage for players
Yeah.
and coaches. They go out on the court and go snap a selfie over there and touch it and be part of it. And yeah, we'll see how we feel about it 25 years from now, whether it'll still seem appropriate, but it seems utterly appropriate now.
Yeah, and then to have that epic men's final also, I think that sort of added another good touch to that. Uh, and to have his like the biggest rivals on the court in that ceremony, I think that is something also that made the ceremony even more special. Last thing that I want to ask you is now it's been almost a year since Rafa retired, and when you lose such a personality, there is sort of a void in the sport. Now, and of course, Djokovic is still there, but he's the only one now, as far as the men's side is concerned. Wawrinka, he's still going on, but he's not a big voice in terms of like, having that big personality and one of the big players anymore. I mean, of course, he's won 3 Grand Slams, but
Yep.
you have Djokovic right now, but other than that, nobody is there. What does that do to a sport, like missing such a big player? And going after his retirement, like it's been almost a year. So how does tennis look to you in Nadal's absence so far?
Well, it certainly gave us a more suspenseful French Open final on the men's side than we've had in the era of Rafa, who Rafa never played a five-set final.
Yeah,
And he was 14-0 in
yeah.
French Open finals and never played a five-setter. So that's the one bonus.
Mm,
But I think, Nadal is a character who connected with people over many years, and the tennis has been exceptional in his absence. And let's be honest, he's really been gone for a couple of years now because he
yeah.
didn't play much in 23 and didn't play much in 24. So it's been quite a stretch now, but that intimate connection which you could feel in the ceremony for him this year with the people behind the scenes and the people, out there in the stands is very deep. And though Alcaraz and Sinner have put on quite a show and are showing super high level of tennis, and certainly especially on the Alcaraz side, have a lot of charisma, that connection that you establish with a champion like a Nadal or a Federer happens over a long period of time and not easily replaced. So I would argue that there's a lot of diversion and a lot of spectacle right now, but there's sort of that richness and that depth isn't there, and that's what you miss. And someone like Rafa, is under the microscope for such a long time. You watch him grow up, you watch him, turn into a very polished champion who's comfortable in the spotlight and really brings his personality over a long time to the sport. That cannot be easily replaced. But I do feel like men's tennis has gotten lucky because Alcaraz and Sinner have gotten the chance to bounce off of Nadal and now Djokovic for an extended period and really make their name, playing against those players and being connected with them. And for Alcaraz to be with Nadal at the Olympics and doubles and Davis Cup, he really got a good sense of who he was. So they're feeding off of that and they're taking that as their role model. And so that's the legacy. But yeah, I think there is a bit of a void, even though men's tennis is fascinating with Nadal gone.
Okay, if you had to complete the trilogy and write a book on Djokovic, what would the potential title be? Is there something in the works?
I'm not going to tell you my title, but I'm
Okay.
not sure what will happen, whether this book will get written or not. I just saw that today he's talking about playing until 2028 and the LA
Yeah.
Olympics. We have a little bit of time, looks like.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. He goes to 41. A lot of people he
Yeah.
likes in this era have played into their 40s, and Federer retired at, in that stage too. So not so surprising. So we have
Okay,
time.
if
But
not
but the
your
best,
title. Yeah.
but the best title that I heard that's not mine
Yeah.
um, was from the tennis podcast, and it was from Matt, and it's called. His title was The Disruptor,
Yes.
and I think
I
that's
mean
pretty good.
that's pretty
I'm
good,
not saying
yes.
that's what it's going to be, but I thought that was a pretty good one, and I give him credit for it.
Yeah. Okay, Chris, I think that's been a lovely chat. Great having you on the podcast. And I recommend the book to all my listeners, to all the listeners of the Sportstar podcast. Go to a nearest bookstore and do read The Warrior, Rafa Nadal and His Kingdom of Clay. I'm sure most of you think that you know a lot about his journey, but then Chris does a fantastic job of, coming up with details which I'm sure you don't know because even I didn't know about that. So I highly recommend this book and do check it out. Chris, thank you so much for giving us your time. And once again, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for your continuing interest in my work. And I'm always touched and honored to be included in a chance to talk to people about tennis in India because I know it's got a rich history and a rich culture of the sport there, and it's always a privilege. So I appreciate it.
Thank you.